The trouble began the very week Daniel moved into Ashgrove Estates, a neighborhood that looked peaceful from the outside but simmered with the kind of quiet hostility that only a deeply entrenched HOA could create. Daniel had purchased the house after months of searching for a place where he could settle into a slower, calmer life. As a disabled veteran, he valued independence more than anything else, and the small two-story home with a sloped driveway seemed like the perfect place to rebuild that sense of comfort. The only thing missing was a proper wheelchair ramp leading up to the front porch, a minor upgrade he had already planned long before the moving truck even arrived. He installed the ramp himself, aided by a few neighbors who had been eager to welcome him. First, everything felt warm and neighborly. People walked over with baked goods, handshakes, and introductions. Children on bikes paused to watch him work, and the whole process seemed harmless, even wholesome. But this quiet goodwill lasted only until the HOA president, Karen Wilford, returned from her week-long vacation. Karen was known throughout the community as the unofficial monarch of Ashgrove Estates. Self-appointed, self-important, and self-sustaining through fear, fines, and an obsession with control. Her reputation for enforcing obscure rules and inventing new ones precede her the way storm clouds precede lightning. The residents tolerated her because fighting her always seemed to turn messy, public, and expensive. Most preferred to simply comply or stay beneath her radar. But when she saw Daniel's wheelchair ramp, she declared war. From the moment she laid eyes on the wooden structure, something in her seemed to ignite. It wasn't the safety of the neighborhood she cared about, nor the cohesive aesthetic she often preached about. It was something more personal, the fact that something had happened in her domain without her approval. The ramp represented a disruption of her authority, and in her world, that was unacceptable. Daniel didn't immediately know he had sparked her fury. The first indication came in the form of a crisp letter placed neatly on his front door, styled like an official government notice. It cited obscure HOA guidelines supposedly prohibiting unapproved structural additions visible from the street. The tone was severe, almost theatrical, as if crafted to intimidate. Buried near the bottom was a threat of fines, hearings, and potential legal action if he didn't remove the ramp within 10 days. Daniel read the notice slowly, feeling a familiar heaviness settle into his chest. Not fear, but frustration. He had dealt with far more serious opponents than a suburban tyrant. Yet, he had hoped his post-service life would be free of petty battles. He hadn't come here to pick fights, but he also couldn't, and wouldn't, abandon a necessary structure that granted him access to his own home. He set the notice aside and tried to carry on with his day, determined not to let the HOA ruin his new beginning. The ramp was legal by federal accessibility standards, and he assumed the matter would sort itself out. But within 24 hours, Karen escalated her efforts. She began appearing on the sidewalk across from Daniel's home, walking back and forth slowly, with the clipboard she always carried pressed tightly to her chest. Sometimes she stood completely still, simply staring at the ramp as if she could will it out of existence. She took photos, jotted down notes, and waved other board members over to inspect the structure as if it were a biohazard. Residents who previously greeted Daniel warmly now looked conflicted, caught between supporting him and avoiding Karen's wrath. Meanwhile, Daniel went through the HOA bylaws with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Hours of reading revealed something interesting. Nowhere did the rules mention accessibility structures. The vague language about unapproved additions didn't supersede federal protections. In fact, the HOA had no authority to demand the removal of a ramp intended to accommodate a disability. The more Daniel read, the clearer the picture became. Karen's demands weren't supported by anything other than her own sense of power. Still, she persisted. Within days, she issued a second notice with increased severity, adding inflated fines and threatening to file a lien against his property. She distributed printed flyers to nearby homeowners claiming Daniel's ramp violated the visual harmony of the neighborhood, even though several homes had front porch steps in worse condition than his ramp. Her campaign morphed into a personal crusade, and soon enough, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with whispers about the escalating conflict. But while Karen attempted to bully Daniel into submission, he quietly prepared his response. He organized every relevant document, his medical necessity forms, accessibility laws, and the HOA's own rulebook. He collected statements from neighbors who witnessed him installing the ramp properly and safely. And most importantly, he requested an official hearing with the HOA board, knowing that Karen would be forced to present her case publicly as the hearing date approached. The atmosphere in Ashgrove Estates shifted. People sensed that something unprecedented was about to unfold. Karen, who usually controlled matters behind closed doors, now had to defend her behavior in front of an audience and her fellow board members. Residents who had grown weary of her authoritarian ways quietly hoped this would be the moment she finally overstepped too far. Daniel, meanwhile, maintained an outward calm, though inside, he felt a mixture of anticipation and exhaustion. He never wanted to be the center of neighborhood drama. He had moved here for peace. Yet, peace was impossible with someone like Karen exercising unchecked power. If he didn't confront her, someone else would suffer next. And the next. And the next. His ramp had become more than a personal necessity. It had become a symbol of resistance against a force that had dominated the community for far too long. The night before the hearing, the street seemed unusually still. Curtains twitched as neighbors peeked outside, and lights flickered behind living room windows as people prepared popcorn for what they knew would be the most eventful HOA meeting in years. The entire neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath, and as the sun set behind the trees and Daniel wheeled himself onto his porch, the ramp beneath him sturdy and unmoving, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the end for Karen's reign. The stage was set, the lines were drawn. The morning of the HOA hearing arrived with an unusual heaviness in the air, as though the entire neighborhood sensed the impending shift in the balance of power. A thin mist hung over Ashgrove Estates, softening the edges of the manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges that the HOA so obsessively guarded. For once, the quiet streets weren't filled with the typical early morning joggers or dog walkers. Instead, people lingered near their windows, watching for any sign that the confrontation they'd been anticipating was finally beginning. Daniel prepared himself in silence. He meticulously reviewed the stack of documents he had organized over the past week, ensuring every page, every citation, and every photograph was in perfect order. His military training had sharpened his ability to stay calm under pressure, but even he couldn't deny the faint tension buzzing in his chest. Confrontation didn't frighten him, not after everything he'd lived through, but he resented that he had to fight a battle over something as basic and necessary as a wheelchair ramp. Yet, somewhere beneath the frustration, there was resolve. What Karen had done wasn't just petty. It was cruel, and the community had suffered under her regime for too long. If he didn't stand up now, she would continue steamrolling anyone who dared to live in their own home without first seeking her permission. By noon, the community center's parking lot was nearly full, a rarity for HOA meetings. Residents who hadn't attended a single session in years suddenly developed a keen interest in neighborhood politics. Some came out of curiosity, others out of quiet rebellion, and a few simply hoped the spectacle would break the monotony of suburban life. People stood near the entrance in small clusters, whispering in low tones, their eyes frequently darting toward the spot where they knew Karen usually parked her silver SUV. When Daniel arrived, several neighbors subtly nodded to him, their expressions supportive yet cautious. In Karen's territory, openly choosing sides could be dangerous, but the tide was shifting. The more she had tried to punish Daniel, the more people began questioning the woman who claimed to act for the good of the community. Inside the meeting hall, rows of metal folding chairs faced the long table where the HOA board usually sat in a tight, authoritative formation. But today, the board members looked uneasy. Papers shuffled nervously, pens clicked repeatedly, and sideways glances darted across the table. Even they seemed to know that Karen had dragged them into something bigger than a simple compliance issue. Karen herself arrived moments before the meeting began, striding into the room with a rigid posture and an expression designed to convey confidence. But beneath the mask, there were cracks. Her eyes were sharper than usual, her movements tense, and her jaw clenched with every breath. She was accustomed to orchestrating situations behind closed doors, not defending her actions in front of a crowd. As the room settled into an anticipatory hush, the meeting officially began. The opening statements from the board were generic and practiced, covering routine neighborhood updates that no one in the room actually cared about. Everyone was waiting for the same thing. And as the agenda reached the dispute item labeled accessibility structure violation, the atmosphere shifted palpably. All eyes turned to Daniel, then to Karen, as though watching two opposing forces collide in slow motion. The board invited Karen to present her case first, granting her the authority she always wielded with a heavy hand. She stepped forward, clutching her clipboard like a shield. Her voice was firm, but those who knew her well could detect the tremor beneath the surface. She argued that the ramp disrupted the aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood, that it was installed without proper approval, and that other residents had complained about its appearance. Her speech was polished and rehearsed, sprinkled with phrases meant to invoke concern for property values and community standards. But as she spoke, the room's energy shifted further away from her. Several residents exchanged skeptical glances. A few quietly shook their heads. They knew the truth. No one had complained until Karen returned from her vacation. The so-called community concern was nothing more than a weapon she used to justify her personal vendetta. When it was Daniel's turn, he approached the table slowly, moving with deliberate steadiness. He placed his neatly organized folder before the board, the pages crisp and clean. He explained the necessity of the ramp, the legality of it, and the complete absence of any HOA rule that prohibited such a structure. He cited federal accessibility regulations and provided written confirmation from his doctor. Then he presented photos of other neighborhood features: poorly maintained fences, mismatched shutters, and faded mailboxes, all of which had gone unpunished under Karen's leadership. The room grew quieter with each point he raised. Board members who had once supported Karen without question now seemed trapped between loyalty and undeniable facts. Even those who tried to maintain neutrality found themselves shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Then came the moment that changed everything. Daniel revealed a series of recordings, videos taken from the security cameras installed on his property. The footage showed Karen pacing in front of his house, photographing the ramp repeatedly at odd hours. It showed her placing flyers on doors late at night, long after community guidelines prohibited solicitation. It showed her speaking with board members in hushed, almost conspiratorial tones right outside his property line. The room erupted in murmurs. Karen tried to maintain composure, but her face betrayed her. The confident mask she had worn for years cracked under the weight of undeniable evidence. Her usual sharpness faltered, her breathing quickened, and color drained from her cheeks. It was the first time many residents had seen her without her armor. The board members exchanged rapid whispers among themselves. Even they understood that Karen's behavior went far beyond normal HOA responsibilities. The recordings made it clear. This wasn't about a ramp. It was about control. When the board finally addressed the room, their decision was hesitant but resolute. They ruled that Daniel's ramp was fully permitted under federal law and was not in violation of any HOA guideline. Moreover, they announced that an internal review would be conducted regarding the actions of the HOA president. Karen stiffened, her grip tightening around her clipboard as if it were the last remnant of her authority. A heavy silence fell across the hall. The residents knew what they were witnessing wasn't just a simple ruling. It was a crack in the foundation of Karen's reign, a moment when the community saw her not as a leader, but as someone who had abused her power for far too long. Yet even as the meeting adjourned and people began to file out, whispering excitedly about what had just unfolded, Daniel sensed something deeper. He could feel Karen's gaze burning into him, heavy with resentment and humiliation. He knew this wasn't the end. People like her didn't surrender easily. They retaliated. And as he left the community center, rolling down the ramp that had started it all, he had a sinking feeling that the next chapter of this battle would be far more intense. For Karen had lost control. In the days following the hearing, Ashgrove Estates transformed. What had once been a community governed by quiet compliance suddenly thrummed with a new kind of energy, curiosity, anticipation, and a subtle but growing defiance. People spoke more openly now, exchanging stories in hushed yet excited tones about incidents they had long buried under Karen's rule. For the first time in years, residents felt safe enough to discuss the patterns they had seen, the intimidation they had endured, and the absurdity they had tolerated. But beneath this awakening, something darker brewed. Karen, stripped of her composure at the hearing, retreated into the shadows of her own making. She avoided public appearances, her once routine patrols halting abruptly. The familiar echo of her footsteps and the snap of her clipboard were absent from the sidewalks. Yet, while her presence faded, her resentment grew sharper. The humiliation she suffered in front of the community had wounded her pride more deeply than anyone imagined. To Karen, reputation mattered above all else, and someone had dared to tarnish it. And that someone was Daniel from the outside. His home remained unchanged. A quiet, modest house with a neatly swept porch and the sturdy ramp that had sparked a neighborhood revolution. But inside, Daniel found himself hyper-aware. Though he kept busy with daily routines, a low-level vigilance threaded through his days. His instincts, sharpened by experience, whispered that the battle wasn't over. People in power rarely surrendered gracefully, and Karen was no exception. Then, late one evening, the retaliation began. Daniel noticed the first signs when he returned home to find a fresh stack of anonymous complaints taped to his door. They were written in the same rigid, curt tone that had become Karen's trademark. The accusations were bizarre, allegations about yard maintenance, noise violations, and even claims that his home's exterior lighting was disruptive. None held any merit, and each was more frivolous than the last. Still, their rapid appearance made one thing clear. Karen had redirected her attack from the public sphere to the shadows. The following night, someone left an unmarked envelope in Daniel's mailbox. Inside was a printed packet of fabricated eyewitness statements, accusing him of altering the neighborhood's appearance and creating a hostile environment. The papers were sloppily assembled, rushed in a way that betrayed the desperation behind them. But even as he read through the baseless claims, Daniel felt something shift. Not fear, but resolve. Karen wasn't just losing. She was unraveling. By the end of the week, her quiet sabotage escalated further. Security footage revealed her walking past Daniel's home at 2 in the morning, pausing near his ramp and porch, her expression difficult to read in the dim light. She didn't touch anything, didn't say anything. She simply stared for several minutes, motionless and unervingly still. The video was unsettling, not because of any direct action she took, but because of the raw anger etched into her posture. Residents who once feared her now spoke openly about the unfolding situation. Some stopped by Daniel's house to offer support, sharing their own encounters with the woman who had ruled the HOA with an iron fist. They recounted tales of fines issued for imaginary violations, of threats delivered during private confrontations, and of the way she manipulated the board to serve her whims. Many admitted they had wanted to stand up to her but never felt confident enough to do so. Until now, word of the internal investigation into her conduct spread quickly, gaining momentum as more residents submitted written complaints. Board members who previously aligned themselves with her leadership now distanced themselves, wary of becoming collateral damage in her downfall. The community's collective voice was growing louder, and for the first time, Karen's power was slipping beyond her grasp. The turning point arrived during a special HOA meeting called to discuss the investigation's findings. Unlike previous gatherings, this one felt different. The room was packed, standing room only. As people filed in, eager to witness what they sensed would be the climax of a long, unspoken battle, Karen entered the hall with forced composure, her shoulders stiff, her eyes narrow. She carried her clipboard, as she always did, but the familiar confidence that had once made her presence intimidating was gone. Instead, she looked defensive, coiled tightly like a cornered animal. The board presented the results of their review, detailing a long list of policy violations, abuses of authority, and acts of targeted harassment. Each point chipped away at the fragile barrier Karen had constructed around herself. Photos, timestamps, and testimonies formed a damning portrait of a leader who had weaponized her position to satisfy personal grudges. Throughout the presentation, the room remained eerily silent. Residents listened with growing disbelief and shock, some nodding knowingly, others exchanging looks of vindication. For years, many had sensed these abuses but lacked proof. Now the evidence lay bare before them, and then, with the same formal tone that had once enforced Karen's whims, the board issued their final ruling. Karen was to be removed from her position as HOA president effective immediately, barred from holding any leadership role within the association, and placed under formal review for potential legal repercussions. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps filled the room. A few people couldn't suppress small, incredulous laughs. Others simply stared, stunned by the magnitude of the decision. The woman who had dominated Ashgrove Estates for nearly a decade had been dethroned in a single afternoon. Karen's composure shattered. Her face flushed with fury, her hands trembled around her clipboard, and for a moment, she seemed at a complete loss. The control she clung to so fiercely had evaporated, replaced by the realization that the community she once commanded now saw her as the villain she had become. She left the meeting abruptly, her departure punctuated by the hollow echo of her heels on the linoleum floor. And the days that followed, the neighborhood experienced a transformation. Without Karen's oppressive oversight, residents felt lighter. Children played more freely in the streets, homeowners worked on their yards without fear of scrutiny, and neighbors who rarely spoke before now greeted each other with renewed warmth. The tension that had long lingered in the air dissolved, replaced by a sense of unity and relief. As for Daniel, his ramp remained exactly where it always had been, sturdy, welcomed, and unchallenged. Though he never sought to become a symbol of change, the community quietly acknowledged that his resistance had sparked a shift long overdue. People approached him with gratitude, often sharing how his stand against Karen inspired them to reclaim their voices. Eventually, the HOA underwent a complete restructuring. New board members were elected, empathetic, level-headed individuals determined to rebuild trust and foster genuine community spirit. They amended outdated rules, created transparent policies, and implemented checks to prevent any single person from wielding unchecked authority ever again. Ashgrove Estates began to thrive, and while Karen retreated into obscurity, rarely seen and never heard from, her legacy faded quickly, replaced by stories of resilience and collective courage. The reign of fear she had established was over, and the neighborhood had moved on. Daniel found peace at last. True peace, not the fragile quiet he had walked into months earlier. His home became a sanctuary, a place where he could finally breathe without anticipating conflict. And every time he rolled down his ramp, he felt not just the ease of accessibility, but the weight of a victory that had reshaped an entire community. The battle had ended, the neighborhood had healed, and the ramp that started it all stood as a reminder that even the smallest structure could topple the largest ego.